It was a typical evening in the Grand Concert Hall, a place where the most renowned musicians in the world would gather to perform. The walls were lined with velvet curtains, and the air buzzed with excitement. The audience, filled with wealthy socialites, critics, and other famous musicians, waited for the performance to begin. The man they were all eager to see was none other than the famous pianist, Alexander Morozov. His name was known across the world for his extraordinary talent, and his reputation preceded him wherever he went. He was not just a pianist, he was a superstar in the classical music world. Alexander stood backstage, adjusting his tuxedo, his mind focused on the performance. He was a perfectionist, always striving for the flawless execution of every piece. His hands were steady, but his nerves still had a way of creeping up on him, especially before a big performance. Still, he was confident. After all, he had played in front of royal families and presidents. There was no audience too big, no hall too grand for Alexander Morozov. He had earned his place at the top, and nothing could shake his confidence. As the stage manager gave him the signal, Alexander stepped onto the stage. The audience applauded, and he gave a small, gracious nod. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, every gaze full of expectation. He sat down at the grand piano, adjusted his posture, and began his performance. His fingers moved with grace and precision, each note a perfect reflection of his years of dedication. The music filled the room, flowing like a river of sound, enveloping everyone in its beauty. But in the middle of the concert, something unexpected happened. As Alexander played, his eyes drifted across the audience, and he noticed a woman sitting near the back. She wasn't dressed in the elegant attire the other guests wore. Her clothes were simple, and her posture gave the impression of someone who didn't belong in a place like this. She was sitting quietly, not with the air of someone who had come to impress, but with the calm presence of someone who had no expectations. It wasn't that she looked out of place, it was more that her simplicity stood out in a room full of extravagance. Alexander had seen plenty of people like her in the past. They were the ones who sat in the back, the ones who only came to watch, perhaps out of curiosity or for the experience, but never for the music itself. They didn't understand what it took to reach this level of artistry. They were the people who would never be able to appreciate the depth of his talent. A mischievous thought crossed Alexander's mind. Perhaps it was his nerves making him a little too bold, or maybe it was just the sheer boredom of playing to an audience that expected nothing more than perfection. Whatever it was, he decided to make a joke. It would be harmless, of course, but it would. As the months passed, the woman's life continued to change in ways she had never imagined. What had started as a single, unexpected performance on a grand stage had blossomed into a full-fledged career. She had recorded her first album, performed at major concert halls, and shared her music with people all over the world. The story of the woman who had once been just another face in the crowd, playing for the love of music, was now known far and wide. She had become an inspiration, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most unexpected places. But despite all the attention and success, there was still one thing that held the woman back: doubt. As much as she had grown, as much as she had accomplished, there were moments when she questioned whether she truly belonged in the spotlight. She was still the same woman who had played on an old, worn piano in her grandmother's living room. She had never sought fame, never aimed for recognition. Now that it had all come to her, she sometimes felt like she was an imposter, like she didn't deserve all the praise. One evening, after a particularly successful concert in a grand theater, the woman sat alone in her dressing room. The applause was still echoing in her ears, but it felt distant, almost unreal. She looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. How had she gone from being a simple woman with no real ambition to standing in front of thousands, playing music that touched people's hearts? The thought of it still overwhelmed her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. The concert had gone perfectly, but there was a feeling of emptiness that lingered. What if she was just a one-hit wonder? What if the world would soon forget her and her music? It was a thought that she couldn't shake, no matter how much Alexander assured her that she had something special, something that could last. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. She looked up, startled, and saw Alexander standing in the doorway. His presence always brought a sense of calm, as if his confidence in her was enough to lift her doubts. He had been there from the beginning, supporting her when no one else had. He was the one who had believed in her talent, even when she hadn't believed in herself. "You did amazing tonight," Alexander said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. "The audience loved you." The woman smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I know. But I don't know if I'll ever feel like I truly belong. This isn't what I expected. I'm just a woman who loves to play the piano, not someone who's meant for all of this." Alexander sat down across from her, his expression soft but serious. "You know that's not true. You're not just a woman who loves to play the piano. You're someone who has touched the lives of so many people. You've done something rare, something special. You didn't just play tonight, you connected with your audience in a way that most musicians can only dream of. Your music isn't about perfection. It's about honesty, about being real. And that's why people are drawn to you. They see themselves in your music. They feel what you feel when you play." The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I'm not like other musicians. I didn't study for years in conservatories. I don't have the technical skills that others have. What if people realize that? What if they stop listening to me because I'm not perfect?" "Perfection isn't what matters," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "It's about what you bring to the music. You have something most musicians don't, a heart that shows in every note you play. That's why people love your music. They don't care about your technique. They care about your soul. And that's something you can't learn in a classroom." The woman sat back in her chair, taking in his words. She had always been so focused on the idea of being perfect, of playing every note correctly. But Alexander was right. She had always played from her heart, never concerned about the rules or the expectations of others. She had played because she loved the music, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all she needed to do. "I still don't know if I can keep doing this," she said quietly, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "What if it all fades away? What if people stop caring about me and my music?" Alexander smiled warmly, as if he had heard these doubts before. "It won't fade away. You've touched too many people, and once you've done that, it doesn't go away. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you. And you're doing that better than anyone else." For a moment, there was silence between them. The woman felt a sense of peace settle over her. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to follow the rules. She just needed to keep playing from the heart, just as she always had. "You're right," she said softly, a small smile forming on her lips. "Maybe I don't have to worry so much about what people think. Maybe I just need to keep doing what I love." Alexander nodded, his smile warm and reassuring. "Exactly. And as long as you do that, the rest will follow. People will always appreciate your music because it's real. That's the gift you have." Over the next few weeks, the woman found herself growing more comfortable with her place in the music world. The doubts that had once consumed her slowly began to fade as she focused on what really mattered: the music. She didn't need the approval of critics or the validation of the industry. She just needed to keep playing, to keep sharing the music that came from her heart. And with each performance, she felt more at peace with herself. Her concerts continued to sell out, and her music reached more people than she had ever thought possible. The woman had become a symbol of authenticity, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful art comes from the most unexpected places. She wasn't just a famous pianist, she was a voice for those who had always felt like they didn't belong, a voice that showed it was okay to be imperfect, to be real. And through it all, Alexander remained by her side, not just as a mentor but as a friend. He had given her the confidence to embrace her gift and share it with the world. But more than that, he had shown her that the most important thing was not the accolades or the applause, it was the music itself. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, the woman stood backstage, taking a deep breath as she prepared to face the crowd. She had come so far from the shy, nervous woman who had stepped onto that stage for the first time. She was no longer afraid of what people thought of her. She had learned to trust in herself and in the power of her music. As she stepped onto the stage and the lights shone down on her, she knew she had found her place. The applause that greeted her was no longer a source of fear. It was a celebration of the journey she had taken, a journey that had started with a simple love for music and had led her to a place where she could truly be herself. And with that, she began to play. Days that followed were a blur for the woman. What had started as a chance encounter in a concert hall had turned into something far beyond anything she had ever imagined. After her performance, Alexander had been adamant about helping her. He spoke with such passion, convincing her that her talent deserved to be shared with the world. But even with his encouragement, she still felt like she was living in a dream. She had never wanted fame or attention, she had only ever played for the love of the music. Yet now, she found herself faced with an opportunity she couldn't ignore. Alexander arranged for her to meet with a few music producers, and soon, she was in a professional studio for the first time. The producers were kind but very clear in their expectations. They knew they had a rare talent in front of them, and they wasted no time in getting to work. At first, the woman was nervous. She had never been in a studio, and the equipment, the microphones, and the unfamiliar environment made her feel like an outsider. But Alexander was there by her side, guiding her through each step of the process. He reassured her, telling her to focus on the music, and that everything else would fall into place. One afternoon, as they were working on recording her first track, the woman began to relax. She closed her eyes and let the music take over, allowing her fingers to move naturally across the keys. The producers watched in silence, amazed by the way she played. They had expected a good performance, but what they were witnessing was something extraordinary. Her music wasn't just about technique, it was about feeling, about emotion. Every note she played seemed to tell a story that resonated deeply with anyone who listened. As they finished recording, Alexander came over to her, his face filled with admiration. "That was incredible," he said. "You've done something that most musicians spend their entire careers trying to achieve. You've captured a raw, honest emotion in your music, and it's going to touch people in ways they've never been touched before." She smiled shyly, unsure of how to respond. For years, she had played in solitude, never expecting anyone to hear her. Now, here she was, on the verge of releasing her music to the world. It was exciting, but it was also terrifying. She had always feared that her music wasn't good enough, that she wasn't good enough. But with each word of encouragement from Alexander and the producers, she began to believe in herself more. Perhaps she really did have something special to offer. Soon, news of her recording sessions began to spread. The story of the unknown woman who had wowed the famous pianist and music producers caught the attention of the media. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the thought of being featured in articles and interviews made her feel uneasy. But Alexander was there to help her through it all. He encouraged her to focus on the music and reminded her that the attention wasn't about her, it was about the message her music carried. The day the article about her first performance was published was the day everything changed. The headline read, "The simple woman who stunned a piano master and the world with her music." It was an understatement. The article went viral, and soon, people from all over the world were reaching out to hear more about the woman who had played with such heart and soul. The media coverage was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about the fame. It was about the opportunity to share her music with a wider audience than she had ever dreamed of. One day, while scrolling through her phone, she saw a message from one of the top music magazines. They wanted to feature her in an interview. She almost couldn't believe it. It felt surreal. She had never imagined herself being interviewed, let alone being featured in a music magazine. But Alexander, as always, was there to reassure her. "This is your moment," he said. "You've earned it. Your story is inspiring, and people need to hear it. Just be yourself, and everything will fall into place." The day of the interview, the woman found herself sitting in a small studio, facing a reporter who was eager to know everything about her. The reporter asked her questions about her upbringing, her music, and how she had learned to play the piano. The woman felt nervous, but as she spoke about her grandmother and the music they shared, her nerves slowly melted away. The love for the music was what had driven her all these years, and it was that love that had brought her to this moment. She realized that it wasn't about her, she wasn't the story. The music was. When the article was published, it didn't just highlight her talent, it highlighted the power of passion and perseverance. The piece talked about how she had spent years playing on her grandmother's old piano, never expecting anyone to hear her music. It talked about how she had been called to the stage on a whim by one of the world's greatest pianists and how she had captivated everyone with the honesty and emotion in her playing. The article concluded with the message that music wasn't just about skill, it was about feeling, about connection. As the weeks went by, the woman's life began to shift in ways she never expected. Her first album, a collection of the pieces she had recorded with Alexander's help, was released to glowing reviews. People from all walks of life connected with her music. It wasn't the polished, perfectionist music that many were used to hearing. It wasn't the fast, flashy performances that were often celebrated in the industry. It was raw, simple, and full of emotion. It was real. Soon, she was invited to perform in concert halls around the world. The first time she stepped onto a stage in front of a large audience, she felt the same nerves she had felt when she was called up at that concert. But this time, it was different. She wasn't just playing for herself. She was playing for everyone who had found something in her music that resonated with them. She was playing for the people who needed to hear that it was okay to be imperfect, okay to be vulnerable. She was playing for the people who needed to feel the same connection to music that she had felt all those years ago in her grandmother's living room. The woman's concerts became more than just performances. They became a celebration of what music could be. Her fans would tell her how her music had touched their lives, how it had helped them through difficult times, and how it had given them hope. Each concert felt like a new beginning, a new chapter in her life. And every time she stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of peace. She had found her place in the world, not as a famous pianist, but as someone who shared the music that had once been her secret. And through it all, Alexander was by her side. He had believed in her from the beginning, and now, he was watching her become the musician he had always known she could be. He had given her the chance to share her gift with the world, and in doing so, he had helped her find her voice. The applause seemed endless, echoing through the concert hall. The woman stood there, still unsure of what had just happened. She had played a simple piece, something she had known for years, but the effect it had on the room was undeniable. She had come to this concert as just another face in the crowd, a quiet observer, never expecting to be called up to the stage. But now, as the clapping continued and the audience showed their admiration, she felt like she had stepped into a world she never thought she would enter. She glanced nervously at Alexander, the famous pianist who had invited her to the stage. He was still clapping, his face full of surprise and admiration. For a moment, she wondered if this was all some kind of dream. How had she gone from being an unknown woman in the back row to playing in front of one of the greatest musicians in the world? She had never considered herself anything special, just a simple person with a love for music. But now, it seemed the world had different ideas. As the applause finally began to die down, Alexander made his way toward her. The audience's cheers slowly turned to whispers, but they still looked at her with wide eyes, some still unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The woman, still processing everything, felt a mixture of confusion and humility. She had never played in front of a crowd this big, and certainly not in front of such a distinguished group. She was used to playing in the quiet of her home, where no one judged her, where the music was just for her. But now, the music was no longer just hers, it belonged to everyone in the room. Alexander reached her and extended his hand. The woman took it, her fingers trembling slightly. She was nervous again, unsure of what he might say. He had been the star of the evening, and she had interrupted that. But instead of the criticism she had expected, he spoke with a tone of respect and admiration. "You're incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. "I've seen many musicians in my time, but I've never heard someone play with such heart. You have something that I can't even describe." The woman didn't know how to respond. She had never thought of her playing as anything extraordinary. She had simply done what she loved. But Alexander's words were sincere, and she could see in his eyes that he truly meant them. His usual confidence seemed shaken, something she hadn't expected from a man of his stature. She wasn't sure if she should be proud or if she should apologize for taking the spotlight away from him. I just play because I love it," she said, her voice soft and unsure. "I'm not a professional. I've never trained like you have. I just learned on an old piano my grandmother had." Alexander nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's exactly what makes it so special. You didn't learn to play for applause or recognition. You learned for the love of the music, and that's something most musicians forget." The woman was taken aback. She hadn't expected such praise, especially from someone like Alexander. She had always thought of herself as just a hobbyist, someone who played when she had time but never really pursued it as a career. The idea of being compared to a professional musician, let alone a world-renowned pianist, seemed absurd to her. As the conversation continued, Alexander asked her where she had learned to play. The woman explained how her grandmother, a retired music teacher, had taught her the basics when she was a child. They had spent hours together, sitting at the old piano, her grandmother patiently guiding her hands over the keys. Those were the best memories of her childhood, simple, peaceful moments spent in the company of someone who understood her love for music. "I never really thought about it as something more," she said. "It was just a way to pass the time, something that made me feel good. I never thought I'd play for anyone else." Alexander smiled, clearly moved by her story. "That's the magic of music, you know. It doesn't matter where you come from or how you learn. What matters is what you give to it and what it gives back. You gave something beautiful to this audience tonight, and you should be proud of that." The woman felt her cheeks flush at his words. She wasn't used to receiving such compliments, especially not in a setting like this. But there was something about Alexander's tone that made her believe him. He wasn't just saying the words to be polite. He truly believed what he was telling her. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I never thought this would happen. I was just trying to enjoy the concert like everyone else." "Well, you certainly made an impact," Alexander said with a grin. "I think it's safe to say that no one here will forget this moment." The woman laughed nervously, still feeling a bit out of place. But as she looked around the room, she saw that Alexander was right. The people who had once laughed or whispered in disbelief were now looking at her with admiration. She had never been the center of attention, never wanted to be. But somehow, the music had pulled her into the spotlight, and now it seemed as if the world was taking notice. "What now?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Do I just go back to my seat?" "No," Alexander said with a thoughtful expression. "I think you've earned a much bigger stage than that. You shouldn't just go back to your seat. You should be up here with me. We could make something incredible together." The woman blinked, surprised by his suggestion. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "you have a gift. A rare one. I've worked with musicians for years, but I've never seen someone who plays like you do. There's an honesty in your music, something raw that speaks to people in a way that polished, perfect performances can't. I'd like to help you share that with the world." The woman's heart raced. This wasn't something she had ever expected to hear. She had always played for herself, for the love of music. The idea of performing on a larger scale, of working with someone like Alexander, felt like a dream she had never allowed herself to have. But now, standing in front of him, with the entire room listening, it seemed like the dream could actually come true. I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said quietly. "You don't have to be ready," Alexander replied. "You already have what it takes. You've just been hiding it all this time. It's time to stop hiding." For the first time that night, the woman felt something inside her stir. It wasn't fear or doubt, it was a sense of possibility, a feeling that maybe she could do more with her music than she had ever imagined. "All right," she said, a small smile crossing her face. "Let's do it." And with that, a new chapter in her life began. It was a moment she would never forget, the moment when her simple love for music brought her into a world she never thought possible. Was still. The soft notes of the woman's piano playing filled the silence like a gentle stream winding through a quiet forest. Each note was simple, but they had a depth to them that made the audience lean in closer. The famous pianist, Alexander, sat quietly in his chair, unable to take his eyes off her. He had expected something far different, a nervous, shaky attempt at playing, but what he was hearing was something entirely unexpected. The sound wasn't polished or refined in the way he was used to, but it was undeniably beautiful. It was raw and real, full of emotion, and for the first time that night, Alexander felt something that wasn't about competition or perfection. It was awe. The woman continued to play, her fingers dancing over the keys with a quiet confidence. The room had transformed from one of judgment to one of admiration. People were no longer laughing or whispering. They were listening, really listening, to something genuine. The applause had stopped, and even the sharp critics in the crowd seemed to hold their breath as they absorbed the music. There was something about the way she played, the way her fingers moved with a natural grace that no amount of formal training could teach. She wasn't just playing the piano, she was telling a story with every note. Her eyes were closed now, her face calm and focused. She had always played the piano in private, never for an audience. The only place she had ever felt this connection to the music was in her grandmother's living room, where the worn keys of an old piano had been the soundtrack to her childhood. She had always played for the love of music, never for recognition or fame. It was her escape, her place of peace, and she never thought it would take her to a place like this. Yet here she was, playing for an audience that had initially expected nothing more than a joke. Alexander couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman's playing was simple, there were no fancy tricks or complex passages, no lightning-fast runs up and down the keyboard. But there was something in her music that struck him. It was the sincerity behind it, the unspoken connection between her and the piano, and the way she seemed to pour her soul into every note. He could hear the years of practice, the countless hours spent playing in solitude, hidden away from the world. And yet, here she was, showing the world a side of music that was often overlooked, heart. As she reached the middle of the piece, the intensity of the music grew. The notes were no longer soft, they were bold and full of life. The quiet, tentative rhythm had turned into something more passionate, something that could not be ignored. Her fingers pressed the keys harder now, the sound resonating through the hall. Every person in the audience was riveted, unable to look away. They could feel the emotion she was pouring into the piano, and it was impossible to stay unmoved. Even Alexander, who had built his career on playing the most difficult pieces with perfection, could not help but feel the power of her music. There was a beauty in her simplicity that he hadn't known he was missing. The woman's eyes opened briefly, glancing at the audience. She could feel the shift. The energy in the room had changed. Where there had once been judgment, there was now respect. She hadn't intended for this to happen. All she had done was sit down at the piano and let her hands do what they had always done. It was never about impressing anyone, it was about expressing something she couldn't put into words. She didn't care if they liked it. She didn't care if they judged her. All she cared about was the music. And yet, as she looked up and saw the faces of the people before her, some with wide eyes, others with their mouths slightly open in awe, she felt something shift inside of her. This wasn't just about playing anymore. It was about sharing a piece of herself. When she reached the final notes of the piece, she slowed down, letting the last few sounds fade into the air. The room was silent for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt uncomfortable or awkward, it was a silence that showed the room had been transported somewhere else, to a place where only the music mattered. The woman's hands lingered on the keys for a moment longer, almost as if she was holding on to the magic of the moment. When she finally lifted them, the spell was broken. But the silence remained. Alexander, still in a daze from the performance, was the first to break the silence. His applause came slowly at first, but as he clapped, the rest of the room followed suit. The applause started as a soft ripple, but it grew louder and louder until it filled the hall. The woman stood up, unsure of what to do. She had never been in the spotlight like this before. She had never been the center of attention. She felt a mixture of shock and humility. She hadn't played for the applause, but now that it was here, it was overwhelming. She wasn't sure how to react. The audience, still clapping, seemed to have completely forgotten about the famous pianist who had been the reason they were there in the first place. No one was talking about his performance anymore. The whispers that had once filled the hall were now about her. How had she played like that? Where had she come from? Why had no one known about her until now? Alexander stood up from his chair, still clapping, and made his way over to her. She looked up at him, unsure of what to expect. Was he going to mock her again? Was he going to make some comment about her playing? But to her surprise, Alexander didn't say anything that was even remotely dismissive. Instead, he looked at her with respect, his face softened by the emotion that was clearly on display. "You," he began, his voice a little shakier than usual. "You've got something extraordinary." The woman didn't know how to respond. All she had done was play. It wasn't supposed to be extraordinary. It was just music. But as she looked at Alexander, standing there, clapping along with the rest of the audience, she realized that maybe it was more than that. Maybe her playing had touched something deep inside them. She had never wanted to perform for an audience, but now, for the first time, she understood why people did it. Music was meant to be shared. It was meant to connect, to touch people in ways that words couldn't. The applause continued, and she couldn't help but feel a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone, it was about finding a way to share her heart. And somehow, she had done just that. Break up the monotony of the evening. He paused mid-performance, his fingers resting lightly on the keys. The audience went silent, unsure of what was happening. Alexander's eyes shifted toward the woman in the back. "You," he called out, his voice carrying across the room. "Yes, you. Come up here and play a piece for us." The room fell into a hushed silence as everyone turned their heads to look at her. The woman seemed startled, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had no idea what was happening, and the laughter that spread through the room made her feel even more out of place. She was just an ordinary woman, and the idea of playing in front of such an important audience, especially after the incredible performance they had just witnessed, seemed absurd. At first, she didn't move. She just sat there, uncertain of what to do. But then, after a few more seconds of awkward silence, she slowly stood up. The audience watched her every move, the snickers and whispers growing louder. Alexander, feeling a strange mix of amusement and a slight twinge of guilt, smiled to himself. This was going to be a laugh, nothing more. The woman hesitated, glancing around at the audience who were now staring at her, some with amused smiles, others with looks of disbelief. She had never imagined herself in this situation. She had never been on a stage like this. She wasn't a trained pianist, she was just a simple woman who had grown up in a small town where playing the piano was a rare luxury. In fact, the only reason she even knew how to play was because her grandmother, a former music teacher, had an old piano in her house. She had taught the woman to play, but it had always been for fun. Nothing serious, nothing that would ever bring her to a place like this. But something inside her stirred. Maybe it was the challenge, maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the situation, or maybe it was the fact that she knew she could play. She had the skill, even if she wasn't a professional. Slowly, she walked up to the piano, the sound of her shoes echoing in the large, quiet hall. Her hands felt clammy, but as soon as her fingers touched the keys, a calmness settled over her. She knew what to do. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone, it was about playing because she loved the music. As she sat down at the piano, Alexander's eyes widened slightly, watching her with curiosity. He had expected her to struggle, to fumble with the keys, and to provide an amusing distraction for the audience. But as she positioned her hands and took a deep breath, something about her demeanor changed. She wasn't performing for anyone else. She wasn't there to impress. She was there because the music called to her. The first note she played was soft, tentative, but it rang out clearly, and there was something in the way it resonated that caused the room to fall even quieter. The woman's fingers moved lightly, hesitantly at first, but then with more confidence. The music that poured from the piano wasn't just a tune, it was something deeper, something raw and unrefined, but so full of emotion that it took everyone by surprise. It wasn't like anything the audience had heard before. There was no perfection in her playing, but there was something so genuine, so heartfelt about it, that it couldn't be ignored. Alexander watched, his amusement fading as he realized that this woman, who he had invited up as a joke, was playing with something he hadn't expected: soul. The simplicity of her playing, the raw emotion in each note, stirred something in him. The audience, too, was captivated. No one had expected this. They had thought it would be a comedy moment, a laugh at the expense of the simple woman. But instead, they found themselves entranced by her music. The room grew silent, the only sound now was the gentle flow of her music. Alexander, once confident in his place at the top, now felt a strange sense of humility. This simple woman, who had come to the concert as just another face in the crowd, had made him question everything he thought he knew about music and about the people who played it.